Hello there. So, an interesting topic for today. Obviously, this relates to Meritaten and Akhenaten and my book on the subject, which is called Scotia, Lost Sister of Tutankhamun. The link for that is in the description, together with some links for a couple of interesting articles that you might want to check out on the subject of Egyptian tombs and the curses associated with them. So this is a bit of a complicated subject because it's something that is actually real, but something that has become ensconced in sort of myth and legends, sort of urban legends, really, because it's very much a modern discovery, the idea of curses being in the tombs of the ancient pharaohs. So this is a thing. This is actually something that you will find going back certainly as far as the 6th dynasty of Egypt. So there was a great fear that I suppose the wealthy in particular had about their curse, about their tombs being disturbed and robbed. Obviously, if you were a pauper, then you didn't have anything to steal, but it was common for the pharaohs and nobles, wealthy people, to be buried with expensive grave goods, which is obviously a temptation to poorer people that, if there's this tomb full of all this loot, very expensive items, it would be very tempting to go and steal it. So one of the things that the ancient Egyptians did was to use tomb curses. Now, these in general would be found in the sort of chapel, if you like, which is the sort of public area of the tomb. Not when I say public, obviously, once the person was buried and it was all closed up, then it wouldn't be public anymore. But in the time period that the person was buried, there'd be the actual location of the sarcophagus, and that would be further in the area that people could visit until it was closed. It was like a sort of chapel, if you like, a tomb chapel. And it would be there at the entrance on the left and right that these curses would be written in hieroglyphs. There was a very unnasty one called the donkey curse, which that's detailed in one of the articles, where it was suggested that if you were to violate the tomb, you would be raped by a donkey, which is an animal associated with Set, who was a particularly nasty god in the Egyptian pantheon. So that's quite a horrible, violent, nasty curse, that one. So the idea being that the threat of these curses and the magic associated with them actually working would put people off. And there was a level of superstition, but obviously grave robbers were not put off to the extent that they didn't try, and they obviously did and succeeded in many cases. In the case of Tutankhamun, his grave was robbed, possibly twice before it was then sort of robbed again, if you like. They call it excavation or archaeology, but essentially it is tomb robbing, isn't it? It may seem justifiable for the sake of history and archaeology, but what actually happens is the very same thing as what tomb robbers would do. The only difference is people aren't really doing it for personal gain. They're doing it to inform academia and the world about the ancient past, but the net effect is still the same. All this loot is taken out of these tombs, and in many cases the body removed as well. Interestingly, in the case of Tutankhamun, his body was reinterred. It's in a temperature-controlled sort of glass case, but it has been returned to the tomb, which you can go and visit, and you can see his body there in the tomb. But that's quite exceptional. There's a lot of tombs where the bodies have been removed, and not only removed, but in many cases they've been moved to the other side of the world. You'll find mummies in North America, in Canada, and even in Australia and the USA. Probably there might be some in South America too, not that I'm aware of, but there could well be. So a lot of these Egyptian mummies have been moved all over the world, which obviously goes against the wishes of the actual deceased people. And one could argue that it's very disrespectful to remove someone from their tomb and cart them off to somewhere else. Not only have they been removed, but obviously the artifacts, their grave goods, have been removed and put in museums all over the world, again, which is somewhat of a desecration, one could argue. That's a complex issue in itself, respect for the funerary customs of older cultures. Some would say that, it's okay to do the archaeology, but then everything should be returned to its original places. And I would say that would be respectful. Maybe that's not always the case. It should be everything be returned, but certainly I think the bodies of these people should probably be returned to their original resting place. And expensive as it may be, maybe it might be more respectful to make replicas of the sarcophagi and coffins and etc., rather than actually putting these forever on display in public places. It doesn't respect the wishes of the deceased in any way, as far as I'm concerned. So, anyway, getting back to the subject, there's been various films made and books written about Tutankhamun, who, as I've discussed in the book, appears to be the brother of Meritaten, who left Egypt, and both of them being the child of Akhenaten. And there's a lot of mystery around the deaths of these people. It's possible that Akhenaten was murdered. It's also possible that Tutankhamun was murdered. Certainly his chest was crushed in, and people discussing his death seem to sort of gloss over this issue of the smashed in chest. There's discussions about the broken leg and the possible gangrene, and the fact he may have had a limp already, and possibly could have died of malaria, but it would appear that he had some horrific accident that crushed his chest, which could have been a chariot accident or something else. So we really don't know for sure what killed him, but he did die young at 18, 19 years old. And is unusual in the location of his burial, and it would appear a lot of the grave goods are those of his sister who left Meritaten, which were repurposed for him. So it's been discussed about the curse, obviously since that time, and a lot of this comes down to another writer, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who popularised the myth. So the main sort of interest in the myth about Tutankhamun's curse comes from the death of Lord Carnarvon, who was, of course, the person who funded the expedition that Howard Carter did. And very shortly after all this was happening, I think it was a month or two later, in 1923, Lord Carnarvon died from complications from a mosquito bite he received actually at the tomb in Egypt, supposedly. And also his dog died very shortly after. There were another few people. At the time there was still a prince, Ali Kamel Gami Bey, I think it's right. He was shot dead shortly after visiting the tomb. Lord Carnarvon's half-brother also died from blood poisoning. There was a millionaire called Wolf Joel. he was murdered a few months after visiting the tomb, and the financier George J. Gould, he died of a fever about 6 months later after visiting the tomb. So there's quite a few deaths there, you know. So there's a few other famous people. The radiologist Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, he died from a mysterious illness, but obviously radiology in that time, severe risk of cancer, might have nothing to do with the curse. So there are some other people that visited. The governor of Sudan, he was assassinated in Cairo sometime afterwards. Another member of Carter's team died from poisoning, arsenic poisoning, some time later. There's quite a surprisingly large list of people who have died subsequent to visiting the tomb. But Howard Carter himself actually lived, I think, into his 60s. He died in 1939, so, you know, he survived. He obviously wasn't affected by this curse. And, you know, hundreds of other people weren't affected either. But it's been dismissed that there was actually a curse, you know, the idea that there was a curse at all. But seemingly it was quite common for these ancient tombs to have an inscription cursing people who entered in bad faith. Not everybody, but obviously the people who came in bad faith, who weren't family members to the tomb, a curse would be put upon them for their desire to ransack and steal from the dead. And supposedly there were was counter curses as such, which would have been uttered by the family to make it clear to the deceased that they came in goodwill, they came in peace, they didn't come to disrupt or destroy or to steal. So seemingly on visiting the tomb while it was still open, the family would utter this counter curse to ensure that they weren't harmed by the curse that had been put over the tomb in writing on the walls. So supposedly that they didn't find anything of this nature in Tutankhamun's tomb, but something else interesting was found in 1925. Henry Field, he reported about this paperweight given to Howard Carter's friend Sir Bruce Ingham. It was a mummified hand. On its wrist there was a scarab bracelet here on the wrist. I'm not sure which hand it was. And there was a curse written on it in hieroglyphs, which reads as follows: "Cursed be he who moves my body. To him shall come fire, water, and pestilence." So, in a strange coincidence, you might say, or maybe not coincidence, after receiving this, Sir Bruce Ingham's house burned down, and when it was rebuilt, it was flooded as well. So that could be just bad luck, or you could attribute to this cursed item, this bracelet. So anyway, there's been a number of TV series and films made about this subject, and there is still this persistent belief in the curse. And I suppose with the anecdotal evidence and the number of suspicious and strange deaths, one could say, yeah, perhaps this curse actually has worked to some extent. So, I mean, along with the actual finds, of course, and the museum displays, etc., there is a tremendous amount of interest in these families. And there would obviously be a desire to avoid what happened to many of these tombs in the ancient times when they were ransacked. Not least would be Akhenaten himself, whose tomb was desecrated, and in fact his sarcophagus was desecrated. The face is ripped off, leaving just a tiny bit of the eye, and then the scarabs with his name upon them were ripped off as well, chiseled away, or as a sort of insult, a curse even, if you like. It was believed that by doing so, the dead person would be unaware of their own identity. They'd basically have amnesia in the afterlife. So this was probably a deliberate attempt by the priesthood of Amun-Ra to destroy Akhenaten in the afterlife. So whether there are any curses on Akhenaten's tomb, I don't know, but certainly there was a desire to conceal his whereabouts. Obviously the original tomb at Amarna was not used. That's in Meritaten, the city there on the outskirts, is where all the royal family were supposed to be buried. Many of them were moved, and obviously the actual final resting place of Akhenaten was found and ransacked, and the desecration of his coffin, and actually his mummy was very badly preserved. In fact, it was really just bones. One can perhaps assume that his body was violated and damaged. They certainly didn't find any of the usual grave goods in that tomb that would be expected to be in a sarcophagus, so I imagine those were stolen and taken away. So it's quite a complicated subject, this whole thing of respect for the dead and the raiding of tombs. Even I think Shakespeare had a curse written on his tomb that terrible things would happen to anyone that would choose to dig up his body or exhume him, because apparently he was quite fearful of that. Although it doesn't seem to have ever happened, but obviously in those ancient times, of the Egyptian dynasties, people were buried with a significant amount of wealth. In the case of Akhenaten, I think it was not to do with any monetary value. It was more about revenge for the sort of desecration, if you like, of the Egyptian polytheism and the introduction of Artenism, the obvious hatred that the priest of Amun-Ra would have had for him. But in most cases, I think the grave robbing was really about money, about gold and other expensive items that were buried along with the body. And then in later times, as Egyptology became more important and more well known, you then had a sort of underground trade in Egyptian artifacts going back into sort of the late 1700s, the 1800s, and early 1900s too. So obviously there's a lot of Egyptian items that have ended up all over the world in sort of scurrilous circumstances, not officially. So this problem of looting and raiding of tombs is something that's continued even into the present day, where artifacts disappear from museums that have been robbed or from archaeological sites. So there we have it, really, pretty much in a nutshell. There's a law. You could look into this more significantly if you want, and I'll put a couple of links, as I mentioned at the beginning. But yeah, cursing on the tombs of the Egyptians was actually a real thing. It did exist. And whether they worked or not is another matter. And I leave it to you to decide whether you think Tutankhamun's curse was real, whether it was effective, or if it's all just a load of baloney, as they say. So anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you found this interesting. Feel free to leave a comment and like and subscribe if you enjoy my work. Thank you for watching. That's all for now.